Dave and I are very, very thankful to be with you tonight. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks, and then the program will continue together. I want to help you to understand that I'm a scientist who has been doing research in the area of creation science for a long time. We've made some progress, which we're going to help you to understand tonight, hopefully. Tonight, David and I are going to bring you the results of not just a few days or a few weeks or a few years, but in my case, a few decades of research. We're going to incorporate what we say scientifically with what the Bible says. And before it's all over tonight, maybe some of you will have a new insight as to where we all came from and what the Bible says as being authentic in every respect. David?
From Genesis 1:1, we want to try to link the phrase "in the beginning" to something we can know and understand from the New Testament. And it turns out that Jesus' own words in the New Testament help us to put a time frame on the phrase "in the beginning." But from the beginning, God made them male and female. So if we can link the term "in the beginning" to the creation of male and female, we've solved one of the big questions in biblical exegesis, and that is exactly when was the earth created? If you believe that the earth was created during creation week, then your answer is solved. And Jesus tends to use that, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. When were Adam and Eve created? In the beginning.
And it's within the 6 days of creation, it says, everything, all that was in them is, heaven, earth, sea, and all that in them is. And so therefore, David, if that is the case, all that in them is, what does that mean about El Capitan?
We're trying to get across an idea. The idea is that can you identify some of the original created material that God spoke into existence during creation week? Now certainly you can look outside here and you can look at some of the man-made objects, and we know for a fact that none of that was part of the original creation. You can even go to places like the Grand Canyon, and you know that that probably was not the way it looked at the time of creation. Even El Capitan itself is probably not the way it looked at creation, but the thing that makes El Capitan different than the Grand Canyon is what? El Capitan is an igneous rock, a rock that was formed, as geologists call it, from a melt, a pluton, a gigantic pluton. We're going to look more into details about exactly what we mean by that. Whereas the Grand Canyon is sedimentary rock that was formed by layers of sediment piling up on one another, then being cut through by massive action of water, which we believe happened during the flood. Psalm 33, 6 and 9 speaks to the rapidity with which God spoke the world into existence. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. The language of that verse tends to make you think that when God speaks, matter comes into existence. It's not something that takes a long time. The spoken word becomes matter. It's instantaneous. The thought that Jesus can create matter, or that God can create matter, should not come as a surprise to anyone who believes in the Bible, believes in the miracles of the Bible, but it is an alien thought for those who have not really given it too much thought in the past. But we're going to be actually looking at evidences in the rocks that suggest that they do not fit a uniformitarian model as the evolutionists must have in order for their theory to be correct. Fortunately, our theory, we don't need to abide by uniformitarianism. We have, by nature of the creation model, has in its at its core the existence of singularities, or in biblical terms, miracles. Look at Romans 4:17. God, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Again, God speaks and he calls into existence things that do not exist.
David, would it be fair to say that what we believe then with respect to Romans 4:17 and that granite rock, El Capitan, that God spoke and it came into existence?
Not only that, that's just a minuscule amount of what was spoken into existence on day one of creation week.
Just a minuscule amount. That's true. That's true. But the fact of the matter is, people here in California, if they understand what we're saying tonight, they can go and take a piece or at least look at El Capitan and many of the other granite rocks, and they can pick it up and say, oh, this is something that God called into existence. This is what we're getting at tonight. And then not only in Genesis and in the fourth commandment, but what do we have here in the book of Revelation?
Well, for those of us who are Seventh-day Adventists, this verse is very familiar. Not only do we look at Genesis as a guide to tell us about creation, in Exodus, in the fourth commandment, we can go all the way to Revelation 14, and I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel, to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. It's interesting to note that God chooses to identify himself in the book of Revelation in a very specific way. He wants to identify himself as the God who made heaven and earth and the sea. All of these things God made, and he wants to identify himself as the creator.
So if the earth was created by God, there must exist in the beginning rocks. That is, Genesis rocks, the Genesis rocks that God called into existence on day one of creation week. And now it says, in the beginning and the foundations of the earth. What does it say about this, in the beginning?
Sometimes it's nice to go to the Bible and actually try to get some phraseology that helps us put in perspective exactly what we see when we go to the science. And in this case, Hebrews 1:10 uses the phrase, foundations of the earth. Now, we're going to actually key in on that a little bit, and we're going to look at something just a little bit later that actually tries to identify what are the foundations of the earth. Because in the Bible it says, in the beginning, when was in the beginning? From the beginning he made them male and female. We'd like to submit to you that in the beginning actually means creation week. It's not something that's, shrouded in mystery here. It's pretty straightforward. In the beginning, you laid the foundations of the earth. When you build a building, what do you start with? You start with the foundation. You start with basically digging a hole and then laying the foundation. Before the foundation is laid, there's nothing.
What we're saying is God himself actually identified for the here and now which rocks were the in the beginning rocks, which rocks were actually created. They're specified as those which are the foundations of the earth. And we're going to return to this again. David, there was a drill hole back in the Kola Peninsula. What's that all about?
Science News is just a popular news magazine that kind of tries to capture the headlines in science. And in this particular article, the article talked about Earth's foundation rocks revealed by a deep drill hole in the Kola Peninsula in
David,
Russia.
How far down did it go?
And it went down almost 40,000 feet into the earth, which of course is just a little bit compared to the overall radius of the earth, or the diameter of the earth. But nevertheless, it was deeper than what had originally ever been drilled before. And in the process of drilling this hole, scientists were actually testing what the results of drilling this hole were, the actual core samples that they were collecting, versus what the scientific theory was predicting would be at those depths. And it's interesting to note that the article just says, we can just read it, geologists are often interested in studying the hard crystalline rocks that form the foundation of all continents. According to the theory, the crust resembles a layer cake with sedimentary rock layers on top, acidic granite-type rocks on the bottom. Now that's the theory. When the drill actually reached a depth of 7.5 kilometers, or over almost 40,000 feet, the scientists did not find basaltic rock. The Soviets now believe that if the basaltic layers exist, they must lie much deeper. Kohler revealed how far from truth scientific theory can roam.
What they're basically saying is they thought they were going to hit granite rocks right away and then go down into basaltic rocks, which is a secondary rock. But it turns out it was granite down 40,000 feet. That's why they said the granitic foundation rocks. So we're saying that indeed by geological drilling into the earth, geology has actually affirmed experimentally that indeed the granite rocks are the skeletal framework, so to speak, just like our bones are, of course, for our bodies. The granite rocks are the skeletal rocks, so to speak, of all the continents, truly the foundation rocks. If the earth was formed, remember we said by creation, then we had in the beginning and what we just read about the foundations of the earth. But now we're saying if the earth, however, was formed by evolutionary processes, then
there must exist rocks that formed naturally by cooling slowly over the presumed long ages of geological time. What and where are they?
So we're aiming toward this contrast between something that was created and something that evolved slowly. And what are the geologists saying about that? Interesting, there are some similarities. Geologists claim to know which rocks form naturally by slow cooling of what they claim is the multi-billion-year age of the earth. They postulate, again now, hard crystalline rocks such as granites are those rocks. It is the linchpin of all the theory of evolution. Now we really need to understand what we're getting at here. See, the evolutionists are saying that they too have a special interest in granites. They too have a special interest in El Capitan. But it's far different than what we have been saying.
Their theory can be summarized by this slide. Molten rock or molten magma is theorized to exist miles and miles below the Earth's surface. Over the course of hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of years, this molten magma cools from the outside in slowly. And in the process of cooling, it's also under great pressure. So the resultant type of rock is what geologists call an igneous rock, but in particular, these types of rocks that form so deep underground are typically, a popular example is a granite rock, such as the El Capitan. So you could say if that's really true of how granite forms, how come you see El Capitan rising above the ground as it is? Well, geologists would be quick to tell you that that's not where El Capitan formed, but it formed deep underground, cooling slowly over millions of years.
David, let me ask you a question. It says evolutionary theory of granite formation. We're going to come back to this from time to time, but that word theory, for example, we see volcanoes erupt and the lava comes out and the rocks form. There's no theory there. There's an actual experimental observation. Why does it say evolutionary theory? We need to clarify that.
It's a theory because it's difficult to take the processes that are theorized to occur deep in the earth and to put that into a laboratory. It doesn't mean that it hasn't been tried. In fact, we're going to look a little bit later at where scientists have actually tried to duplicate the conditions deep in the earth with slow cooling to try to duplicate what they feel like happened with the formation of granite rock. For instance, if you have a sedimentary rock, such as a sandstone, you can actually take the constituents of sandstone and put them together, put them in a press, and actually sort of form sandstone itself in a laboratory under conditions similar to what it's theorized to form naturally. But granite rock is a little bit different. When you go to attempt to make a granite rock using the formative processes which are theorized to cause granite rock, you actually find that you get a different type of rock, a rhyolite. And this is going to be kind of a very important part of our presentation, that man cannot reproduce what God has created. And before you just completely turn that off, let's look at some of the yet more evidences that we have that perhaps these rocks really are created rocks and not something that forms slowly over geologic time. There's a booklet, Science and Creationism. And this booklet was published by the National Academy of Sciences. Who has heard of the National Academy of Sciences? Anyone? It's a very prestigious scientific organization. And basically what they say goes. If you disagree with them, you're wrong. And this is what they have to say. In their booklet, published in 1984, they said, listen, folks, in layman's terms, we've given special creation a chance. We've done everything we can to sympathetically consider it. And you know what? It's wrong. In the forms given in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, the theory of special creation is now an invalidated hypothesis. Now just hold on a minute there. Look at what the atheists are saying about what is spoken of in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. In their model, the first 2 chapters of Genesis describes a special creation, not some long geologic evolutionary process. So if you believe in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, you've got to believe in a special creation. That's even the National Academy of Sciences even would agree with that. But the point here, of course, is that they say that special creation is an invalidated hypothesis. In other words, scientifically, it's not true. But we would like to present evidence tonight that would show that it is true.
You know, David, as you say, they've had fantastic influence here in America over the last several decades because the National Academy of Sciences is composed of the leading scientists here in America and even around the world. So when they speak, then of course, you know, vast numbers of people, laymen and so forth, take it as gospel truth. And they're basically putting out the word, as you have just said, that the Bible is wrong. Now, they're not saying that God doesn't exist, but that's what's implying. They're basically saying God is a liar when they say that Genesis has been invalidated by professional people, by people who really know what's going on. In other words, the rest of us people, you know, supposedly don't know as much as they do. We just don't know. But if you really knew all the truth that they know, all the science they know, supposedly you would believe like that. Well, David and I have some other things to say about that. We say, however, that God does not intend, this is David and I talking tonight, God does not intend that the Bible record of the literal Genesis 6-day creation and the 7th-day Sabbath rest to lapse into some obscurity and ridicule without providing scientific evidence that affirms these records. In other words, we're taking big-time exception with what the National Academy of Sciences says. We're doing it not only from the Bible, we're going to do it from the standpoint of science and show it's exactly the opposite of what they've been saying for all these years. We also say the Lord has allowed us, David and I, to discover the evidence, this evidence that overturns what the National Academy of Sciences is saying. We're saying that God has allowed us to discover evidence that affirms literally what the Bible says in Genesis, 4th commandment, and all parts of the Bible that relate to creation. The Lord has allowed us to discover this evidence of all places, and it's embedded in the granites, God's Genesis rocks. Well, there it is. The evidence is embedded there, and we're going to find out what this evidence is here as we continue. Years ago, as I spoke at the University of Tennessee, I wrote a letter to the then president of the National Academy of Sciences. And basically what I was saying to him is, I'm offering therefore you, whoever you may choose, to send in your stead an opportunity for refuting the evidence for creation published in my scientific reports and summarized in my book. I'll refer specifically to when that was said sometime later. But he is president. At that time, he was president of the National Academy of Sciences. And before I spoke at the University of Tennessee, I wrote him a letter. And I said, you know, I don't believe what you're saying is true in the National Academy of Sciences booklet we just spoke about. You said Genesis has been invalidated. But I'm going to present evidence that night at the University of Tennessee to overturn what you say and to show that indeed there is scientific evidence for creation. And I said, I'm inviting you to come. If you think you have anyone in the staff of the National Academy of Sciences to come and overturn or refute this evidence I'm going to present, which has been widely published, you should come, or you should send some people. Well, he didn't come, but he wrote this letter. He wrote a letter to me afterward. And that's interesting in itself. Press's answer, his answer that night, your work on radio halos is a matter of record in journals and can be debated by scientists. That's the way science works. I cannot agree with your contention that one small piece of data invalidates the vast body of evidence from geology, astronomy, biology, radio dating, the fossil record, genetics, and other fields that taken together irrefutably show the age of the earth is about 4.5 billion years. Let's get the background here. See, Frank Press, eminent scientist, president of the National Academy of Sciences. I had been publishing for years evidence for creation, and everybody had been ignoring it. I was then going to speak at the University of Tennessee, and I wrote him this very, very straightforward letter, and I said, you think you got it all made? I said, we're going to overturn everything you're saying, and we're going to do it tonight at the University of Tennessee. And see what he says? He says, we cannot believe, cannot agree that your condition, one small piece of data invalidates everything, geology, astronomy, biology, radio dating. That's exactly what David and I plan to do, intend to do tonight. Well, as we continue, that's something special we're talking about is, guess where? It's in granite rock, which is what is made of. Now, Capitan is made of granite. This is a piece of granite rock. Something special is found in the black mica specks in granite rock, not only in El Capitan, but in granite rocks all over the world. When Frank Press talked about the small piece of data, he didn't bring out the fact that indeed it's all over the world. He sort of hid that in that letter. But anyway, David, there's that granite rock, and it's got some pieces of a little black mineral, mica, in it. And we're going to look now under the microscope, and we're going to see rings. A center, you can see a dark center there. If you look carefully, I'll try to isolate it there on the screen. And there indeed we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rings. Where in the world did they all come from? This was taken through a microscope, so of course it's very, very small. And so, David, this is a cross-section now. Tell us what we're looking at.
Well, you have to understand that the granite rock that you saw in just a few slides ago, what you actually do is you find crystals of the larger crystals of that the black specks in the granite actually exist in certain locations, making it very easy to make thin sections from those crystals, and then those you can analyze under the microscope through a light transmission microscope. And in the process of doing that, you do see these, after a bit of looking, some concentric circles, which actually are three-dimensional objects, spheres, concentric spheres, which when you slice them through cross-section appear as rings when you look at them in the 2 dimensions. And what it means is that there's a tiny radio center that was radioactive and emits through nuclear decay alpha particles, and with each successive alpha decay through various steps toward stability, you have one more ring being formed as the literally millions of alpha particles are being showered out in 3 dimensions from this radio center. And as the alpha particles go out, they actually discolor the biotite or the mica matrix so that a record is left in the granite. Now, there are certain rules that you have to be aware of in order to have halo formation occur. One of those is that the rock needs to be in a cooled state. In other words, it can't be hot, certainly can't be molten, can't be cooling slowly over millions of years in a hot molten state. If you had it that way, the halos would never form. So you need the rock to be in a very cooled state and in a sense, able to capture the radioactive decay. So this is a schematic showing which alpha energies correspond to each ring that we saw in the picture there.
It's not important that you actually understand all the actual ins and outs of those ring structures there, but what we want to do now is to go to the next one and say that indeed this is the alpha decay chain of uranium, and it's all those particles being emitted and all the daughter products there. And we don't need to go into all the details. We just want to show you that's the alpha decay chain of uranium. But then, I want to go back there just a minute. You notice that indeed at the last part of that decay chain is polonium, 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 polonium. Now, that polonium in the uranium decay chain would be called secondary because it's a derivative, a daughter of the original uranium nucleus. But now also, what would happen, for example, if instead of starting at the uranium, we start now with polonium, and polonium-218 to 214 to 210, and then lead. This is important because we're going to find that indeed this idea of primordial polonium,
This is from the isotope polonium-210.
that's the isotope.
As you can imagine, the polonium-210 isotope just has one alpha particle, hence you just have one ring. Now, the proponents of the people that don't believe, well, actually, we should talk more. Let's just keep talking here about what the polonium halos mean in terms of creation.
Our monitor has come back, David.
The whole idea, that's okay. The whole idea is that if you have an isotope which has a very short half-life, and you have that very short half-life isotope in a rock which has already been theorized and proven irrefutably to have taken billions of years to form, and yet that isotope only lasts for just the length of time of the half-life of that isotope. In the case of polonium-210, it's 138 days. In the case of polonium-218, it's 3 minutes. Then you have to explain somehow in your model, not our model, not the creation model, in your model. Let's say your model is evolution. You have to somehow explain in your model how did the polonium halos survive for hundreds of millions of years while your molten rock was cooling, and the polonium halos, the polonium that was in that rock was decayed, hundreds of millions of years ago before your rock even cooled. And so people have thought about that a little bit, and they say, well, it must mean then that there must be some other source of polonium that's feeding the radiohalo inclusion sites of these polonium halos. In fact, many people believe that, because there's essentially, if you don't believe that, there's no other way to explain polonium halos except in any other model except basically instant creation. And so people are diving on that explanation because that's all they have for their very existence. They're diving on that because if they can't somehow say that the polonium that formed that polonium halo was somehow derived from uranium, and by the way, uranium has a long half-life of the order of millions of years, then you're locked into a paradox. The paradox of how you have a short-lived isotope in your long-lived rock. And so there you have it. But if you believe in the creation model, it's not a problem at all. You just say, it's easy. God, when he created the rock, he created the polonium isotopes in the rock, and then they just started to decay after creation. And he did that to leave a record of his creation. That would be our model. And so you can actually do some scientific experiments to try to verify, whether or not the polonium that caused these halos is actually primordial polonium or secondary polonium. Secondary polonium would be from uranium-238. Primordial polonium would be polonium which has no precursor, polonium that was made from the beginning. Polonium basically that you have to admit was created by God in the beginning.
Let's go ahead and show them some more of these polonium halos as you were talking about. Can you believe this? The Lord actually put a pair of spectacles, so to speak, in a rock, in a granite rock. What's happened is that one of those halos we just saw, many of them were actually emplaced one right after another or decayed there. So now we're looking at the spectacle halo, which no one has ever had a satisfactory explanation for, except that God created it. Here we have these two halos with the two rings, the inner ring, the outer ring, and this one now actually began. We don't have to all know the details tonight, but it's from the isotope of polonium. Polonium just being...
Go back to that slide just for a second. You see the line going down there between to the radio center on the right there, on that right polonium-214 halo there? That is what the detractors will say. Aha, you see that little line? That's what the uranium must be flowing through to feed that polonium radio center. But, the problem is that if there's uranium in that solution that's supposedly feeding that polonium inclusion site, it absolutely has to leave alpha decay tracks in its wake as it's traveling to the site. There's no way that, in other words, uranium is an alpha emitter. As it's flowing to that site, it has to leave some kind of record that it's there. So basically, the point of all the scientific papers which were published at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was to try to document the lack of evidence of uranium feeding these halo inclusion sites. So whoever you talk to that says, oh, no, the polonium halos are secondarily created, or they're secondarily made by being fed by uranium solutions going through the mica, doesn't really understand what the published papers were trying to explain. This is a very critical point. I mean, we could sit here and talk the rest of the night just about this one point. The point is that you cannot have a uranium solution feeding these sites without evidence that the uranium was there. You can't turn off the alpha decay of that uranium while it's feeding your polonium halo inclusion site. You can't do it. So there's ways to actually etch the mica with acid to actually see the alpha recoil tracks. You can actually measure the density of those alpha recoil tracks and say, you know what? If uranium is feeding these sites, then we should be able to see an increased density of alpha recoil tracks heading or feeding these polonium halo inclusions. What in fact you see is a diffuse background, a background of alpha recoil tracks which has no increased density as they go to the radio halo centers. None. Right there in and of itself is proof that nothing else is going on. But you could, and there's lots of other questions that people have asked that said, well, if God really wanted to prove that the Earth was created using radio halos, why didn't he make halos from the other decay chains, the thorium decay chain, or other short-lived halos that would have really kind of put the nail in the coffin? What is your answer when they ask questions like that?
You know what? It's interesting that when we find something widely published actually showing that indeed these particular halos form from these particular isotopes, and there's no evidence, of course, to indicate otherwise, lead isotope ratios in the centers and so forth, that indeed they can't explain it. They have no explanation for it. We say it's creation by fiat. They have no explanation for that. So what's the best way to try to divert attention away from the fact that they have to face the music, so to speak? They don't want to face the music. They don't want to say anything about the evidence. So they raise the question of what doesn't exist. In other words,
we could spend all night trying to figure out why God did it this way. Why didn't he do it this other way? Okay, well, why didn't he do it this other way? I mean, you can go on and on and on forever trying to figure out why God didn't do it another way, a way that you think would have been smarter. You're smarter than God. The fact is that why don't we just focus on what exists and try to explain what exists? That's what we're trying to do. And I don't make any apologies, frankly, for supporting that these halos represent a rapid mineral crystallization of the granites. It's just not a hard thing for me to believe in, because I already believe in the Bible. Yeah, that helps a lot if you already have a basis in believing the Bible. If you don't believe in the Bible to begin with, what are you going to do? You're just going to be faced with some tiny piece of evidence that you can't explain any other way. But no matter what, the people that want to say that these polonium halos existed for millions of years as their uranium solutions were feeding these sites don't understand that halos can't even form in a rock that's molten anyway. So you've got so many things going wrong with the theory of trying to hold on to rocks that cool slowly over millions of years that you can't really even make a tenable theory out of it from the beginning. And so, yeah, people a lot of times come up to me and they say, you know what? I just don't understand. I just think that the Earth is really old. Life is young, but the Earth is old. But see, that doesn't make sense in our model either, because if you have the rocks with scientific evidence in the rocks of being crystallized rapidly, what do you do with geologic long ages? Long ages for the framework, the foundations of the Earth. It doesn't fit into the model. So then, these are all things that are going through my mind when people are saying, I just don't have a problem with believing that the earth is billions of years old. I have a problem with it scientifically, not to mention biblically. We could just talk about the science of why it doesn't make sense to believe that the rocks that form the foundations of the earth are ancient. It's just that simple. I wish it could be more complex than this, but it's really not. It's a very simple thing that we're talking about here. The way that we disprove that the halos were not formed by secondary, uranium processes, that is complex. But that's why the papers were published. They were published to leave a record that still stands to this day that has not been refuted.
David, what can I say? That's an excellent summary. Let's let the people see the other couple of polonium halos here. This one was started by an isotope of polonium with only that 3-minute half-life. And I want to pick up on what David just said. There are people who continue to say, well, no, they're not really primordial, made in the beginning, and so forth. And so over 30 years ago, I published to the entire scientific community. I challenged them. I simply said, if you don't believe that these halos indeed were formed by God supernaturally, the only option is they had to form naturally. You have all the ingredients to go back and try to form these halos in the granites to reproduce them. I've challenged them over and over and over again for 30 years to say, if you don't believe this evidence for creation is really of God, then you should be able to reproduce it. Oh, no. They don't want to hear that. You will never find the evolutionists even mentioning the fact that they fail to actually do the very fundamental thing that science requires. If they believe a theory, and they have all the material, of course, to try to duplicate it, they should be able to do it. We're going to get into that a little bit later on, more specifically, so you'll have a better idea. Right now, as David has pointed out so clearly here, we're saying that these halos are primordial. Now, whatever. In other words, this little illustration right here, at the top we have a glass of water, we put in Alka-Seltzer, and after a minute or so, it's gone, okay? But down at the bottom, you put in the Alka-Seltzer, and if you instantly freeze the water when the bubbles are coming out, then of course the bubbles are going to be in the glass. And also the bubbles are going to be there after 100 years. In other words, for the actual radioactive particles to shoot out and have a record there in the granite rock, it has to be what? Formed simultaneously with the injection of the radioactivity in the rock. It's simply bing, 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 bing. And it's all along. Now look at this next slide. What is it? Good old El Capitan again. We're saying that these halos are in El Capitan. And so we go from there to, David?
Again,
what are the implications?
We're going back to what the Bible says, that the word of the Lord was used to speak the earth into existence. All the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake and it was done, he commanded and it stood forth. And there's really no other way to say it.
And he actually then decided for us living here today and for those in the last days who are in any way doubting the Genesis record of creation in Psalm 33, 6 and 9, he left something here to affirm scientifically what he said. That's all there is to it. Back in 1981, after I had been at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for over 10 years as a guest scientist, publishing papers on what we're talking about tonight, bringing out to the scientific community the evidence for creation, and virtually getting no refutation, the laboratory was letting me remain year after year and year after year because I was publishing these papers. Not because I was publishing the papers per se, but because the papers were being published and the personnel at the laboratory could see there was no refutation. They could see these articles were being published in the world's esteemed scientific journals, and there were no evolutionists that were being able to shoot the evidence down. So I went to this trial, and over here on the left-hand corner, you can see the people who came to the trial, the scientists who came to the trial for the evolutionist position, and on the right, the scientists who came to the trial for creation. What happened is, earlier, in the early part of 1981, the state of Arkansas had passed a law requiring the teaching of creation science in the public schools. The ACLU challenged that law, and I was asked to come and testify about the scientific evidence that I had been publishing. Well, my wife and I prayed about it, and if something happened to indicate that's exactly what I should do. I should go and testify. I realized, however, that in doing this, it was going to go out not just to the scientific community now, it was going out to the world. And I had a pretty good idea that the laboratory management was going to take a very dim view, because throughout the scientific community, they had, in a sense, tolerated me being there at that laboratory, saying all these things about the evidence showing that indeed the earth was formed very, very rapidly, that it's very, very young. This is something that doesn't exist. A scientist came over from Germany one day and came up to talk to me, and as a result of that, he went back and talked to the chemistry division director. I was in the chemistry division. He went back and told the chemistry division director after he talked to me. He said, you know, if Gentry lived in Russia, he was a German scientist, well known. He said, if Gentry lived in Russia, this is now about 1979 or thereabouts, 78, he would be shot. In other words, if a man such as myself were to go and try to find and publish something in Russia at that particular time, he was saying to the chemistry division director, I would be shot. He said, in Germany, if he were over here doing the work here in Germany, which, you know, I'm the head of a big laboratory myself, if he were here in Germany, he would starve. In other words, nobody, he would not support my work, no one would support my work, regardless of these reports. He said, only here in America, with you, meaning the chemistry division director, is Gentry able to do the work that he's done and get these papers published. I know what the answer was for me being able to stay there that long. That was the God of heaven intervening to help me use the marvelous facilities of the laboratory and the friendship of the people of the laboratory for a long period of time to get these results out to the world. Well, what happened here at the Arkansas Creation Trial, it turns out, I'll mark here on the screen, the gentleman, Brent Dalrymple, who was there to testify for an ancient age of the earth. He was one of the world's eminent geologists. He was there to testify and to affirm, you know, ancient earth, so therefore evolution of the earth, evolution of life had to have happened. And that's exactly what he did. And yours truly, of course, at that particular time, I'm down here on the lower right. You can see I'm flashing the light up there. That's where I was, and along with several others who came to testify for creation. But remember we said that Brent Dalrymple was an eminent scientist? David, what happened there in March 2005?
In 2005, we see that Brent Dalrymple was given a National Medal of Science from President Bush. And the reason we show this slide is basically just to try to show people that Brent Dalrymple is somebody that, you know, had made a lot of contributions to science and was recognized by President Bush with this medal. But in the process of making these contributions to science, he also wrote some letters which were used. Are they going to be showing next here?
We'll be showing those later on. Then.
He wrote some letters. We're going to be seeing some of those letters in a minute that actually give an indication of what he feels like is wrong with the Genesis movement, as he calls it.
But right now at the trial, Brent Dalrymple was testifying. Now this is what the judge, the Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General David Williams, Brent Dalrymple was on the witness stand. And he was, for example, like right here. And the judge, Overton, was right here. And he was being cross-examined by David Williams, who was standing almost 5 or 10 feet from Brent Dalrymple, who was sitting in the witness stand. And he was going through a series of questions of Brent Dalrymple, trying to find out exactly more. Brent Dalrymple had already testified about the ancient age of the earth and on and on and on. In fact, he said that people who believed in creation and the young age of the earth were, guess what? They were like flat earthers. In other words, they were really off track. But the Assistant Attorney General, David Williams, got around to asking him about my work. And he said, Dr. Dalrymple, what about Robert Gentry's work? And this is what he had to say. On the witness stand there with a full course of the audience and the judge listening, and also it's in his It's a record of the trial itself, and it's copied there in my book if you're ever interested in reading. Go ahead.
Right, it's part of the trial transcript. Basically, Brent Dalrymple's explanation of the polonium halo research, he states this. He says, also in Gentry's work, he proposed a very tiny mystery, which is balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence. Notice the similarity between what the National Academy of Sciences said in its booklet, Science and Creationism, or Frank Press's letter response to Dad, where he says, I don't see how one piece of data can balance the overwhelming information on the other side. And here, Brent Dalrymple is saying the exact same thing. A tiny mystery balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence, but he does think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. And for most people, I'll just tell you this, most people, the answer to that little mystery is simple. It was formed by some uranium precursor which has, millions of year half-life. That's their answer. That's the only answer they can come up with. And that answer was refuted by the published papers. But anyway, the rest of his thing, he says, he's trying to explain now exactly what is this little mystery. He says, if you have a granitic body, a rock that comes from the melt, that contains this mica, and it cools down. It takes millions of years like that for a body to cool, so that by the time the body cooled, the body of rock is what he's referring to here, all the polonium would have decayed. What happened to the Alka-Seltzer tablet a minute after it was put in the glass? It decays away. All the activity from the tablet is gone. Once it's gone, can you capture the activity of the tablet fizzing in the water? No. Once it's gone, it's gone. The same thing with the polonium halos, so that by the time the body cooled, all the polonium would have decayed, since it has an extremely short half-life of the order of minutes. Therefore, there would be no polonium in the body to cause the polonium halos. So what Gentry is saying, this is primordial polonium. In other words, primordial polonium, not polonium derived from uranium. And that was the subject of all these papers. Therefore, the granite mass in which it occurs could not have cooled slowly. Therefore, it must have been created by fiat instantly. The essence of what really is behind the research on the polonium halos is not that difficult to grasp. What's difficult to grasp is what follows in train if you accept that scientific evidence. And that is basically you can no longer have long ages. You can't have your long ages for the rocks to form. You can't even have your long ages prior to the formation of life. You can't have it. And it kind of makes common sense a little bit, because if you really believe that the 6 days of creation are literally occurred like they are stated in the Bible, it's not hard to accept the fact that God on day one of creation week spoke the earth into existence. Just like on day 4 of creation week, God created the lesser light and the greater light. Oh yeah, he made the stars too. So if you really want to believe that the earth is billions of years old, you've got to also believe that the sun and the moon and the solar system are billions of years old. But that all flies in the face to the plain word of the Bible. To say then that, well, somehow there was a shroud, which was covering the moon and covering the sun, takes away from the literal wording of the verse when it says he made two great lights, the lesser light to rule the night, the greater light to rule the day. You can also go into the Greek and try to look at the origins of the words, but to me, it makes sense in English. I can read it in English and I can figure out what's going on. I can read the 4th commandment in English, and it says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Revelation 14, worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. It's very simple. God wants to draw our attention to the fact that he is the creator. If we take away any of that, we're diluting what the plain word of the Bible is saying, period. Why do we want to do that?
David, let's ask this question. This man is an eminent geologist, world-renowned and so forth, and there he is testifying that, and there's a room full of reporters and everything. It got some coverage, but for all practical purposes, the people who were there, the writers and so forth, the reporters who were there, minimized the fact that indeed this evidence was being presented there, something in the rock that formed very, very quickly. You had to have something around it to catch the radiation instantaneously, or else you don't get anything. And yet the reporters that were there, with few exceptions, said almost nothing about this evidence. Now, here it is. For example, see, the evolutionary view is simply that indeed you've got the granite foundation, you've got a molten earth and so forth, and so the granites are forming deep in the earth and slowly cooling. But what we've just seen is a comparison now. Up top, the top part of our schematic up there, is that if we have radioactive decay plus slowly cooling molten granite, then indeed, radioactive decay, meaning the rapid radioactive decay, slowly cooling granite, there are no halos. Nothing is going to be caught in the granite because it's all gone long before the rock actually formed into a solid. The second one, the second illustration, radioactive decay, rapid radioactive decay, instantly created cold granite. You know, it's just like a Polaroid. I could be up here tonight with a Polaroid camera, if they're still used these days, and we push the shutter, push the button, of course. The flash flashes light, and indeed it goes to the audience, comes back. Now, the shutter has got to be synchronized with that flash of light so that it opens and closes instantly, or at the same time, synchronized for it to come back and go back to the film. The film now records the object, the image of the light. Now, the film then is like the granite. The granite has to be there in a form so that it can capture the radiation. The radiation itself would be like the flash of light going out and coming back through the open shutter. There has to be a synchronization of the creation of the little tiny speck of radioactivity for that polonium halo has to be there along with the creation of what's around it, the granite rock, has to be done all together, has to be done instantaneously, or it's all over in just a very, very, very short period of time. The very fact of the matter is, the reason why you haven't heard of all this before, for all practical purposes, most of you, is because, look at this. Tested theories, go ahead, David.
Tested theories of science such as mechanics, electromagnetism, optics and light, nuclear physics, and thermodynamics have all had their central assumptions validated experimentally in the laboratory thousands of times. False scientific theories are built upon central assumptions which have never been validated. They can masquerade for decades and even centuries before their falsities discovered. And of course, the perfect example of that is the astronomy of Ptolemy. How many knew from their 8th grade science class that there was once a time in Earth history where everyone, all scientists, anybody that had any interest in astronomy, knew that the Earth was at the center of the solar system, that the sun rotated around the Earth, that all of the planets rotated around the Earth, and built an elaborate mechanism which actually predicted, by the way, it predicted very well the planetary motions which were being observed at that time. For hundreds of years, planetary motion was very accurately predicted by the Ptolemaic model of the solar system, where the sun was rotating around the Earth. Now, don't you think that's interesting that such an obvious mistake could be believed and rebelieved and taught for hundreds of years until finally somebody came along called Copernicus and said, you know what? There's a more elegant model which also fits the data. And that more elegant model has the sun at the center of the solar system and the Earth rotating around the sun. Now that actually got him in hot water with what?
With the church, of all things, at that particular time. Let us emphasize what David is saying here. What we're basically saying here, we said the difference between true and false scientific theories is that the true will have its central assumption tested and validated, but the false ones, it can masquerade for a long, long period of time. If you don't test the central assumption here, as David has said, was that indeed the earth was at the center and everything was revolving around. And so an explanation, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of observations were put in to support this Ptolemaic astronomy of the earth being the center of the planetary system. But it was wrong. And the only reason it was found to be wrong is because Copernicus came along and he found that indeed the explanations of the planetary motion fit the sun being at the center and planetary motion then occurring around the sun, which we all believe. So what we're coming around to basically is saying that indeed one of the theories, so to speak, we want to call that scientifically, one of the theories we're talking about tonight, evolution, has never had its fundamental central assumption tested. And as a result of that, all sorts of erroneous predictions, so to speak, have occurred. A lot of many apparently good predictions have been fulfilled. People have focused on the good predictions that have been filled and say evolution has got to be true because we see this observation, it all fits evolution. So therefore, it's got to be true. Well, the very fact of the matter is, there are observations, which we'll bring to you tonight, that will show indeed fantastic contradictions, which we've already been talking about in part. The polonium halos, evidence of Earth's rapid creation, that will never, ever fit the long age of granite cooling. The question, David?
Which of the two has been masquerading as the scientific truth?
Now, when we say which of the two, we mean, is it creation or evolution? Which of these two has been masquerading? Go ahead.
Which of the two fits evolution? Which of the two fits creation? And what part do primordial polonium halos act in deciding the scientific answer?
We're back to this primordial decay of primordial polonium as being something that affirms very, very clearly the fact that the polonium halo, something you can see visually in the microscope, was produced by something that just existed for a short period of time and disappeared, and yet there's an indelible record of it there in the rocks. And that is one of the polonium halos that occur in granites all over the world. So it's something that's a worldwide nature. It's something that David and I believe that indeed was created by God to help people to understand that when God said in the Bible, He spoke. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of His mouth, for He spake and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. Every word in the Bible is true. Even the creation account given in Genesis, which we're going to have more on tomorrow evening. Thank you so much.